Hello, good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you are watching this. I'm going to talk a little bit about anything that I thought about when I was reading this 1843 piece of literature from Thomas Carlyle. I've used it as a springboard to discuss things about productivity, about consumerism, a bit of capitalism, a bit of personality linked with occupation, essentially what I was thinking about at the time when I read this text. I've done a little bit of research, I've been inspired, and I've written a whole lot of stuff in a Google Doc that I will link down below if you're interested in reading about my thoughts, but I'll tell you about as much as I can within the space of this video. As I was putting it together, I realized it's really long, so I am going to include timestamps along here as well as down in the description below, so you can jump to the bits and pieces that you are interested in. There's no real logical way I've put this together. I've kind of just shot off from little bits and pieces I've encountered in the text and put my thoughts to them. So I hope you enjoy listening to it. If I am inspired to talk any more about it, I'll include a part 2. So when we look at Thomas Carlyle's past and present, I'm not looking at it as a piece of ancient Victorian prose. Rather, I'm looking at it in terms of some of the ideas and some of the issues that it brings up that I can then further talk about in our recontextualization of the text within our own time period in our own world. But just in case you aren't an expert in Thomas Carlyle and a bit of Victorian prose, what I am going to do is first I'm going to talk a little bit about context. Okay, so I am having some serious issues with the frame rate right now. It is jumping around. When I download it off Google Drive into my folders, it's fine. When I play it on a different player, it's fine. And then when I import it into this editing program I'm using, I just can't. So I'm gonna leave it, and I'm sorry. Past and Present is a piece of prose that criticises the wealthy aristocratic class of England that rely on the labour of the skilled workers to line their pockets and be regarded as idols. Carlyle believes that the greed of these people will result in the downfall of society. Carlyle believes that in order to find true success and better a society, people in the position need to model hard work in order to inspire others and find their own successes. Carlyle laments that the systems of what would be known as capitalism do not demonstrate compassion for the working class, but rather choke out any ability of finding their individual success. So when we encounter a text from the 19th century, it's not just an easy transition of information. You actually need to start looking at it and unpacking it, and there's a few different ways that we can approach this. The first approach is to understand the author's intention by contextualizing them within their time period. That involves looking at the history that they were surrounded by, the socio-political climate that they were living in, and their own personal beliefs that sometimes colour the way that their writing is read. Some of the advantages of looking at it in this way is that we better understand the historical context, and we can better understand some of the ideas and messages that are coming from the author at that time. The disadvantage, however, is that it kind of sits within its time period and is really difficult to relate to or get any meaning for us today as the current readers. Another way of interpreting a text is by recognizing the parallels between that time period and those issues and the ones that we're seeing in our world today. This approach involves understanding the world this text originally exists within and interpreting the language within this framework. We then find similar examples or other scenarios that can now be applied to what we understand in this world. The advantages of recontextualizing and finding parallels between these two different worlds is that we can start to uncover universal truths, and we can start understanding some of the issues that have always faced humanity, and we can start making judgments on whether or not we are achieving or making changes with those goals in mind. The contextual knowledge of this being Carlyle's scathing review of a aristocratic system that allows wealth to beget wealth is universally applicable. It's something that's happening in our contemporary world today. However, there's still a lot of interesting things that we can unpack within labour without actually using this entire context and just looking explicitly at the words and how we can apply those words to our own life. Another interpretation can be to disregard the contextual clues of the text, sever it from the writer, and reinterpret the words with an entirely new understanding. This last approach involves treating the text as a standalone piece of literature, a vague shape for the reader to impart their own understanding on, and this is my personal favourite. A post-structural reading of labour in which, as a reader, I utilise my own contemporary understanding to make meaning of the text, allows me to use the words of the text as a springboard into discussion of a variety of issues, including a discussion of productivity, value, and capitalism. In order to fully recontextualise the text, we need to decenter Carlyle from our discussion. So the process of decentering an author doesn't mean that we pretend that they don't exist. Rather, we recognise that they are a human being within their own kind of context, and that context and that inflection isn't actually what's important. Rather, what is important is recentering ourselves as the reader and recognising that we bring with ourselves as well our own historical connections, our own pieces of information that we can then construct meaning from. By foregrounding our perspective, we signal an evacuation of the traditional concept of the author and accept what Michael Foucault deemed the death of the author. This doesn't deny the existence of the writer, but does deny his role within the transmission of story to the reader and its resulting interpretation. The interpretation of the reader, then, is of more value than the intention of the author. This view of the death of the author means that the reader themselves is actually really important. So we're recentering ourselves as a significant authority on what the meaning of this text actually is. So then, what is my interpretation of this text? What relevance do these words that were written almost 200 years ago have to our lives now? And what kind of connections can I make with my contextual knowledge to these words? Any reading of a text begins with a close analysis of its title. This book is called Past and Present, the chapter Labour. Every word carries with it a series of connotations and associations that the reader connects with it. We rely on these associations to make connections between images, concepts, people, and events. For me, the first association that I come up with is to the word future. Past, present, and future make up the three temporalities, and by leaving this word out, I am left to overread the meaning. When we unpack the connections we make with connotations and associations, we overread. A post-structural reading acknowledges the significance of each word choice, and composition of such as building blocks of meaning, and these readings can vary. So while I might read the fact that the title is past, present, and no future to be a allusion to possibly there being no future due to the actions within the story, a reader who comes across this with a different contextual lean or a different kind of worldview may see this in an entirely different way. Abrahams recognises that when using this post-structural new critical lens, the risk is that the intensive quest for ambiguities will result in over-reading, ingenious, overdrawn, and sometimes contradictory explications of a literary word or passage. Having two different readings is a feature of new criticism, where a work is regarded as an object entirely separated from its historical and socio-political context. We treat it as an independent entity. In understanding this independent entity, John Crowe Ransom acknowledges the autonomy of the work itself as existing for its own sake, and that's entirely at the mercy of the reader. Therefore, the reader's understanding of even the title greatly contributes to how they're going to interact with this text. Carlyle opens the section with, "For there is a perennial nobleness and even sacredness in work." Of note, the word work here is capitalized, and a technique of capitalizing a noun is a capitonym. The use of this capitonym venerates work into a position of holiness, whereas not to consider work, the physical act of labor, but work as this philosophical concept. And in this way, it deifies the concept of work into a position of something much more important and sacred. He specifically uses the word sacred to make us think of something that is precious and that we should really value and take care of. This capitonym is used to differentiate work, the concept, from work, the physical. Historically, this technique is used to separate the divine from the mundane. Capitonyms are prominent in terminology relating to religion and philosophy. They're used to differentiate between a philosophical concept and an everyday reference, or to demonstrate respect for an entity or institution. An example would be in Abrahamic religions, the capitonyms he and God. By elevating work to this venerable status, labour is seen as not only important to the society that is benefiting and profiting off the labour of our workers, but to the workers themselves. Work is seen as sacred. As a person from a Western country, it's impossible to deny the influence that Christianity has had upon even the fabric of our society. Without being a believer, we are encountering examples of this kind of morality within even the smallest aspects of our day-to-day lives. Our patriarchal systems, our moral codes, the disproportionate value we place on modesty and hard work all stem from this influence of religion. And it's promised that reward comes from hard work, especially in the face of adversity. This obsession with productivity manifests in the idea that if we work hard enough, we will become successful irrespective of our backgrounds and our resources. This type of thinking perpetuates the Stoic ideology of slogging through your work for delayed reward, regardless of your personal feelings at the time. We work ourselves to the bone in our youth for what? Success at a later stage in life? We work tirelessly through the week for a weekend? A whole year's misery for a couple of weeks' holiday? This is an ethos that is required to keep our society running, but it's also a falsehood. Where the effects of one's labour are directly visible and rewards reapable, this concept of working hard for your own success is an achievable dream. You get out directly what you put in. However, with our current globalised market, this culture of working hard has increasingly disproportionate rewards. In order for a person or establishment to become successful in our current market, it needs to ensure its output commodity is of higher value than its input materials, and this includes people. In order to be profitable, a company will need to ensure that its material costs and labour are lower than the ultimate cost of this product to the consumers, which also tend to be these same workers. A worker could spend a whole day building 10 of a product in order to earn enough money to purchase one of those. So in that aspect, the productivity to reward ratio is completely imbalanced. The underprivileged class that works within larger corporations are being manipulated into believing they have a chance in an already rigged game. By working twice as hard and being more productive, they might achieve a minimal amount of success. However, the proportional work to reward is still incredibly unbalanced. The real winner is the company who now has the additional product of your labour. Productivity then is built into our systems to benefit this ever-increasing gap between the classes. Ultivator indicates that the only systems that are actually working to decrease this gap and make more proportional the productivity to benefits balance are systems that are paying people for not working. So it's in the best interests of our aristocratic class to perpetuate this idea of productivity being an important part of our lives. Carlyle then continues to describe the sacredness of work by contrasting it with its opposite, idleness, saying, "In idleness alone there is perpetual despair." The concept of idleness is an interesting one in itself. To remain idle is to be awaiting a change in which you can leap into action. To be idle is to bring awareness to the possibility of movement. We don't describe a statue as idle. Mountains are not idle. Even a machine is only described as idle when it is awaiting a command for movement. The implication within idle is that we are awaiting instruction or purpose to move, to function, and that when we are not doing so, we are not fulfilling our purpose. In 1987, Michael Fries and Gisela Moher led a study looking at the link between depression and unemployment, and they found that it was not the idleness of unemployment that resulted in increasing depth of depression. Rather,
The more objective conditions, such as financial problems and the disappointment of hopes, they seem to be more important, suggesting instead that a good financial condition may shield the unemployed from depression.
The conclusion that we can make from here is that it's actually the social construction of capitalism, the one that tells us we have to work to survive, that places goals financially as important or of a higher status in our relations to other people, this being the penultimate measure of success that actually drives people to work, not actually the fear of being idle.
These findings were also echoed by the peer-reviewed behavioural risk factor surveillance system that looked at unemployment and depression among emerging adults in 12 states, in which results suggest that unemployment among emerging adults may contribute to depression. Contributors in this state included stress because of delays in achieving developmental goals related to the transition to adulthood, including identity formation through exploring work opportunities, and stigma related to unemployment or material deprivation, further proving that these systemic issues are what thrust the unemployed into perpetual despair.
As an educator, it's encouraged that you find yourself, that you understand who you are, what drives you, and what things you want to achieve in order to be a complete human. However, that's just a personal thing that we tend to promote. It's not something that's built into our systems. Our systems and our structure of our society tend to encourage us to find not passions, not things that make us happy, but things that can make us profitable.
Carlyle tells us, "Long enough has that poor self of thine tormented thee. Thou wilt never get to know it, I believe. Think it not thy business of knowing thyself. Thou art an unknowable individual. Know what thou canst work at, and work at it like a Hercules. That will be thy better plan." Under this model, our passions become something to be bought and sold. Creativity has a price tag. With the ease of setting up your own shops on Etsy or with your own website, every creative outlet becomes a business venture. Carlyle's words encourage us instead to find an occupation that we're good at and place all of our energies into being successful in this area. But this limits our freedom for exploration and self-discovery. Rather, we would fall victim to having our work consume us completely. A good example of how this mentality can affect people is in William McFee's Spend Love in Arcady. A retired man is described as no longer married, as they say, to his job, no longer identified with the disciplined organisation of a liner, no longer in possession of a unique place in the hierarchy of a ship. He was, to put it starkly, nobody at all anymore. Within our current society, we do as Carlyle suggests. We make our identity and our occupation one and the same. This encourages neuroses of productivity as identity. When we are unable to do our job, we are distressed and faced with a crisis of self. Even this phrasing, our job, with the possessive determiner our, takes ownership and therefore responsibility for this role.
The way that we speak about our jobs is different to speaking about a job. When we use our, we're actually taking a position of ownership over that role. And if we replaced it with the indefinite article a job, there isn't that same link between occupation and personality. What Carlyle is asking us to do is to make a job our own, to work at it like a Hercules.
The role of an occupation within our society is paramount. In a BBC article looking into why do we ask people we've just met what they do for a living, Alina Disick discussed how this question is used to create a hierarchy within social circles based on perceptions of each person's occupation. Susan Krauss Whitbourne, psychology professor at the University of Massachusetts in the US, recognizes that those who only identify themselves through their work can ultimately fall into depression should it go away. With the unreliability of jobs and the greater possibility of career change at this time periods, it is no longer appropriate to dedicate oneself to singular sets of skills and to find their personality and sense of self around this occupation.
Perhaps then Carlyle's claim that thou wilt never get to know yourself, thou art an unknowable individual, is true when understood through this lens of occupational purpose. How can you truly know yourself if all you've defined yourself by is your occupational stereotypes? Alright, so it's 4 days later. I've finally finished putting a whole lot of the clips all together. Yep, everything everything I filmed that day. It's like this. I've done some drawings and stuff and realised that this is a really long video. So I'm going to stop here, and if you are interested in hearing any more of my thoughts, or if I have any thoughts and I just want to make a video about it, I'll make a part 2. So otherwise, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found something useful. See you later.